144 people died, 116 were children. The National Coal Board had been warned for years. At 9:15 a.m. on October 21, 1966, approximately 140,000 cubic yards of saturated colliery waste liquefied and tore down the slopes of Merthyr Mountain. The black slurry engulfed Pantglas Junior School and 18 adjacent houses in the village of Aberfan. The devastation was absolute. Following resolutions by both Houses of Parliament, the Secretary of State for Wales appointed a formal Tribunal of Inquiry on October 26, 1966. Their singular mandate was to establish the undeniable, factual record of the disaster.
Sir Herbert Edmund Davies, a highly respected South Wales barrister, was appointed as chairman to lead the proceedings. It became the most extensive British inquiry of its kind to date, setting a rigid benchmark for the investigation of public disasters. The mandate provided to the panel was strictly defined. On page 7 of the report, the tribunal establishes its authority, stating, "We were appointed to inquire into the causes of and circumstances attending the disaster which occurred at Aberfan." There was no room for speculation, only the methodical reconstruction of an entirely preventable tragedy.
Chairman Davies established a strict parameter for the hearings. The scale of the disaster required an uncompromising structure to keep the investigation focused on accountability rather than emotion.
The tribunal anchored its entire investigation around 4 fundamental questions. What exactly happened? Why did it happen? Needed it have happened? And what lessons are to be learned? On page 16, the report explicitly notes, "These 4 questions have constantly been in the forefront of our minds, and our report is designed to answer them. Every piece of evidence, every cross-examination, and every witness statement was required to serve one of these 4 pillars."
The raw data of the investigation illustrates the massive, exhaustive scope required to uncover the truth behind the collapse of tip number 7.
The tribunal sat in active session for a total of 76 days. Day after day, the panel meticulously combed true evidence, refusing to rush the process despite immense public grief and mounting anger. As documented on page 8 of the report, the tribunal sat to hear oral evidence in public on 76 days, taking the testimony of 136 witnesses.
Investigators formally interviewed 136 individuals. The witnesses included surviving teachers, grieving parents, local counselors, and officials from the National Coal Board. Their testimonies systematically established a damning pattern of prior knowledge and ignored warnings regarding the waste tips towering over the village. On page 44, the report documents a local official's persistent, ignored frustration, stating, "I was constantly complaining about the danger from the tips."
300 distinct exhibits were carefully examined and entered into the official record. This physical evidence was crucial. It included historical geological maps, deeply concerning internal memorandums, and written warnings regarding the stability of the colliery waste that had been dismissed by management. Page 12 of the report highlights the importance of this paper trail, stating, "We have studied hundreds of plans, maps, and photographs, and read volumes of correspondence and memoranda."
By the time the hearings concluded, 2.5 million words of testimony had been heard and formally recorded. The tribunal processed an immense volume of documentation to build an airtight public record of the events leading up to the disaster. The magnitude of this undertaking is summarized on page 8, where the tribunal notes the daily transcripts of the oral evidence ran to millions of words. It was an exhaustive pursuit of accountability. The proceedings themselves were conducted under profoundly difficult and highly scrutinized conditions, heavily influenced by the deeply fractured relationship between the mining community and the authorities. The Attorney General imposed strict restrictions on media speculation regarding the causes of the disaster before the tribunal even commenced. This legally mandated silence was complicated by intense public skepticism. The public had witnessed earlier inquiries into pit disasters and harbored deep distrust toward institutional investigations. On page 10, the tribunal addressed this tension directly, stating there were widespread fears that the inquiry might become a gigantic whitewash. The panel was required to prove its absolute independence under these difficult conditions.
Evidence gathered comprehensively covered the deep history of local mining and the specific geological conditions of Merthyr Mountain. The investigation revealed that tip number 7 was placed directly over a known subterranean stream. This underground water saturated the colliery waste over a period of years, directly leading to the fatal liquefaction on the morning of October 21. Page 18 of the report is explicit regarding this engineering failure. The disaster was due to the fact that tip 7 was placed upon a site which was totally unsuitable for the purpose.
The individuals who took the stand represented a vast cross-section of society. The tribunal heard from esteemed university professors who provided complex engineering and scientific context on soil mechanics, alongside the young schoolboys who had survived the disaster. The reality on the ground that morning was starkly captured in the testimony of the children. As recorded on page 26 of the report, one surviving pupil testified, "I heard a sound like a jet plane, and then the room went dark and the desks were moving."
A critical admission fundamentally altered the trajectory of the findings in the final days of the proceedings, shifting the focus from fact-finding to institutional culpability.
Lord Robbins, the chairman of the National Coal Board, appeared at the end of the tribunal to give evidence. Despite the National Coal Board's undeniable prior knowledge and ignored warnings spanning several years, the institution's initial stance at the inquiry was defensive. Ultimately, under intense scrutiny, Robbins formally admitted that the Coal Board had been at fault for the tragedy. Page 90 of the report documents his concession. "I accept that the National Coal Board were entirely responsible for the disaster."
The tribunal viewed this as a distinctly delayed admission of responsibility. They explicitly noted that had this admission been made at the beginning of the inquiry, much of the subsequent investigation, painful cross-examination, and gathering of evidence would have been entirely unnecessary. The tribunal's formal condemnation of this delay is recorded on page 91. Had this admission been made at the outset, much time would have been saved and much distress spared.
The exhaustive fact-finding phase eventually gave way to private deliberation as the tribunal prepared to deliver its final report to Parliament. The tribunal formally retired to consider its verdict on April 28, 1967. They spent several months meticulously drafting the definitive 151-page report, ensuring every claim was backed by the evidence they had collected. The report was published on August 3, 1967.
The conclusions within the published report delivered a scathing assessment of the institutional failures at play, specifically citing a failure to heed clear warnings and a total lack of direction from above. The report concluded, and I quote directly from page 131, "The Aberfan disaster is a terrifying tale of bungling ineptitude by many men charged with tasks for which they were totally unfitted, a failure to heed clear warnings and of total lack of direction from above." The tribunal made a specific, carefully worded distinction regarding the nature of this institutional failure. On page 132, the tribunal noted, "Not villains, but decent men, led astray by foolishness or by ignorance or by both in combination, are responsible for what happened at Aberfan. The disaster was born not of deliberate malice, but of profound ignorance, structural neglect, and an inability of those in charge to grasp the lethal gravity of the situation they were managing." The ultimate legacy of the tribunal was its demand for sweeping new legal frameworks. The tribunal's final report made it clear that simply understanding the disaster was not sufficient. The findings required the creation of entirely new legislation to regulate the safety of all tips and colliery waste management across the United Kingdom. The tribunal ordered the creation of a National Tip Safety Committee and mandatory statutory inspections, establishing a permanent legal record to ensure a disaster born of such negligence could never be repeated.